Hey, it's Sam from the SRA Solder Lab, and thanks for joining me. In this expert series session, I sat down with Randy Rubenstein to discuss hydrogen torches and SRA's long history supplying and servicing them. Randy has been the president of SRA since 1999 and previously worked at the Zymark Corporation as director of engineering. He holds a degree in mechanical engineering from Worcester Polytechnical Institute, as well as an MBA. Here is the meeting that transpired. Hi, Randy. How are you?
Good, Sam. How are you doing today?
Very good.
Surviving the quarantine?
Yeah, it's very boring, but
Yep.
makes it work. So I suppose we should start with answering what a hydrogen torch actually is.
Okay, so a hydrogen torch isn't all hydrogen. It's hydrogen and oxygen. And there's several names out in the world. Sometimes people call them hydrogen generators, oxyhydrogen torches, water welders. There's a lot of terms. But basically, it's a product that takes water, breaks it into hydrogen and oxygen, and that's what you burn as your gas.
Very cool. They get pretty hot, right?
They get up to about 5,000 degrees Fahrenheit.
So
it's a perfect ratio of two hydrogen molecules to one oxygen molecule, hence the H2O in water. So there's no unburned byproducts of this gas.
Okay, it's very clean.
Yes, very clean and very hot.
So why would someone want to use a hydrogen torch over, say, a butane torch?
So butane doesn't get as hot, only about 3,500 degrees. Hydrogen and oxygen will burn closer to 5,000 degrees. That's the big difference. And the major difference, propane is kind of dirty. You got a wide, puffy flame, whereas the hydrogen torch will give you a fine pinpoint flame for doing real fine work. The other advantages over like acetylene and MAP gas, which a lot of people use with oxygen to get higher temperatures, is that we don't store any gas. The gas is made as needed. And with a hydrogen torch, with a oxyacetylene, you're going to be having gas tanks in your house, which are a safety hazard. So we have a lot of small jewelers in New York that do jewelry work in their home, and the building codes and the fire department will not let them store gas. So in that case, they use one of our water welders in their jewelry studio.
That's a really good solution for those kind of limitations.
It is, and oxyacetylene, you're going to get a big, wide, kind of puffy flame. It's hard to get a fine point. So when you're dealing with jewelry, you really want, you're just soldering a post on an earring, you really need a fine pinpoint flame. Otherwise, you're heating up the whole part and getting it too hot maybe, and you get too much heat scale buildup when you heat up the whole part.
And you can use a lot of different size tips to get different size flames too, right?
That's correct. So we got 5 different size tips. You can get the smallest tip would be our number 25 tip, which gives you a flame that's maybe 3/8 of an inch long. You can use a number 20 tip, which is a pink tip, and that will give you a flame that's probably about 3 inches long. So there's quite a bit of variation. We also have a power control on it. So within that tip range, we can also modify the amount of gas being made, so you can vary the size of the flame that way. So there's a lot of adjustability.
For the size of the flame, does the tip only change the length or also the width?
The tip will change the length and the width of the flame. The power control also has control of the length and the width, so it's kind of a combination of the two.
Okay. What other common uses are there for the hydrogen torch?
So there's a lot of uses. Glass processing, people will glass or polish the edge of a glass piece that they cut. They'll use the torch for that. in brazing it's used because of the high temperatures. So it's not just soldering, it can be soldering and brazing. Sometimes people will solder wires onto a transformer. Our transformer, we need a lot of heat. They'll use that. Thermocouples, which you can't do with a regular soldering iron. You need a high heat with a fine pinpoint flame, because typically thermocouple wires are very thin. And if you're blasting it with a half-inch wide flame from a propane torch, you're not going to be very successful in soldering onto that. You probably melt the wires. So the other big application is dental appliances. So people making braces for children. That's very common. We have a lot of orthodontists using this torch because of its uniqueness and giving you a fine pinpoint flame, but also keeping the solder joint clean versus acetylene. Acetylene is a very dirty gas, so you'll have black smut flying over your studio and in your house or wherever you're using it. So that's another big advantage. Another one application is medical devices. So we've sold to a lot of the major medical device manufacturers, and they're making guide wires and stents and so forth, something they need real fine pinpoint control on. So imagine a guide wire, they're going into your heart with it. So it's a very, very thin wire, and you need to solder a spring onto it, for example. So they would use our torch for that. And different electromechanical devices where you need high temperature soldering. You can't get out of an iron, so people use a torch because a lot of times it's very fine work. If you use a propane torch, you got too wide of a flame. You may have the temperature you need, but you don't have the type of flame that you need. The other one application is kind of big is for wax castings, cutting off the spew. They use a water welder on that. We've got several big manufacturers that have 8 to 10 of these for their production line for cutting off the spew on the wax castings.
Like what molding is wax molded, and you're talking about the excess.
Yeah, that's the spew. That's a spew that they call it a spew coming off the wax casting, and they clean off the excess with that, and they actually cut the wax with the torch. And it's much faster than trying to take a saw blade or a knife blade to cut it, and then with a welder you can cut it and kind of clean off the edge of the wax without melting it too much using the torch. So those are the big applications. I'd say that the most common would be jewelry, dental, medical, and wax. Those would be the 4 largest applications that we have.
Nice. And how do hydrogen torches work?
Okay, it's very interesting. So a hydrogen torch takes water, breaks it into hydrogen and oxygen gas, and that's what you're burning in a ratio of 2 to 1. But hydrogen gas is somewhat explosive on its own. So when the gas comes out of the machine, we mix it with a liquid, which can be water, it can be a fluxing agent, and that kind of acts as a carrier for the gas and helps it be less explosive. So the way we break the water into the gas, we have a large tank, which is inside the machine, and that's used to as a chamber for the electrolysis process. So in order to do that, we add potassium hydroxide in the tank, which is an electrolyte, and then we apply a high current, low voltage power source to that through the tank, and then it converts the water into hydrogen and oxygen gases, which then come out the torch tip. So they actually get bubbled through, like I mentioned before, a flux booster. You could use water. There's several different chemicals you can use. You can mix something with the flux, with the booster, to give it a fluxing agent to help prevent heat scale on the part to keep it clean. So that's kind of how it works. There's several on the market, but they all have the same operating principles, breaking down the hydrogen and oxygen gas.
Right. So the booster flux, it helps keep the part cleaner.
Correct. So it acts as like a gas shield around the flame. So with a regular torch, you'll see a black, brownish heat scale on the metal as you're heating it. And you have to clean that away with polishing or some chemical processes to get rid of it, like a Sparex or something like that, to get rid of it. So if you use a booster flux, and we sell a booster flux that consists of methyl alcohol and boric acid and some colorant in it. And what that does, you'll see the flame gets, with it, you're heating the part from the flame out, an inch or half inch, depending on the size you're doing. It'll be clean with no heat scale on it, which is a huge advantage for medical device manufacturing and jewelry and any application where you're doing actually metal to metal brazing. With the wax, it's really not an issue, but it's anything where you're adding a brazing alloy or soldering alloy to the part, the booster flux helps keep the joint clean. The other thing the booster flux does, it will drop the temperature from about 5,000 down to 4,500. Makes it a little more controllable. So it's a good add-on. For years, customers have been making their own booster flux, but they've been using the wrong ratios. If you use too much boric acid in the booster flux, you'll clog up your tips quickly, you'll clog up the machine. So about a year and a half ago, we developed our own booster flux with the correct ratios. So it keeps the machine clean, keeps your joint clean, and performs all the functions that it should without any extra maintenance, which is caused by adding too much of the boric acid to the methanol.
Yeah, they're kind of like maintaining a car almost.
They are. So we include a sample of that when you purchase a new one, and we include the electrolyte with that and also the booster flux to try out. So that's been a big help, and we've seen less machines come in for service because of that. They're not getting clogged up with the boric acid powder, which actually turns into like a white powder and it clogs up the torch handle, the booster block, the booster tank. So it just reduces some of the maintenance on the machine.
So when you're soldering parts with the hydrogen torch, do you have to apply anything to the parts, like a flux or a
You should still apply a flux. The booster flux kind of keeps the parts clean, but it doesn't kind of etch the parts or really perform what a flux does, which facilitates brazing and soldering. So you still have to use a external flux, or if you're doing soldering, you may have flux in your solder wire. If you're doing brazing, you would apply some brazing flux, which is typically a solid or like a white paste. A lot of the soldering fluxes are liquids. Brazing fluxes are usually a paste. And the reason they have a paste is so they stay in place longer as you're heating versus a liquid would just kind of run off and burn up quickly.
Okay. Yeah, that makes sense. So it sounds like there's a few hazards with the high temperatures and the chemicals that you're using to make the machine work. Is there any tips for staying
Sure.
safe?
Yep. So the electrolyte is potassium hydroxide, which is a corrosive material. So when you're adding that or cleaning out the machine, you should always wear rubber gloves, which is enough to protect you from that. And then the alcohol and the booster flux is flammable, so you shouldn't have it near any open flames. But that's not really hazardous,
Right.
except for being flammable. So the only area to be cautious is with the electrolyte, and typically you don't have to touch it because you're pouring that into your tank once every 6 months, and then your machine will run. And then 6 months later, you're going to empty out the machine, rinse it out with distilled water, and then add a new can of booster flux or bottle booster flux of electrolyte. to keep the machine running. So as you're emptying out the machine, the water in is going to be somewhat corrosive. So you need to wear gloves and do it. And as far as the high temperature goes, that's true with any torch. You need to use caution around that. One thing that's unique about the flame when it comes out of the tips is the sides of the flame are not hot. All the heat is pushed toward the front cone of the flame. So if your flame is here, you can actually put your finger within, a quarter of an inch of the front side of the flame, and you're not going to feel it because all the heat is focused forward. I don't recommend trying that at home, but you can see that there's no heat, or you can feel that there's no heat on the sides of the torch.
Yeah, and we also have a stand for the handle too, right?
Correct. So you don't have to shut it off every time you do it. So you put the handle in a stand, point it away from you and your work, and then you can do what you need to manipulate your work and apply flux or apply metal to it. And then you can grab the torch with your other hand and continue your process of brazing and soldering.
Okay. For those interested in using a hydrogen torch, what can they expect in terms of how long the chemicals last and any maintenance that we'd have to do on them?
Okay, let's talk about the machine itself lasting. We have machines that have been in the field for 20 to 30 years. They come in for maintenance every year or 2 years, and some of the dates are amazingly old. They've been out there running for that long of a time. So as far as maintenance goes, I mentioned before, the electrolyte, you want to change that every 6 months and rinse out the tank. And when you operate the machine, you want to run it with distilled water, not deionized water. Deionized water still has some minerals in it, and that will cause the tank to rust out. So make sure you're using good grade of distilled water, and that extends the life of the machine.
Okay.
So that's the main maintenance thing you're going to be doing, is changing that every 6 months. Because the potassium hydroxide gets used up during the electrolytic process of converting the water to gas. And the way you'll know that is your flame is smaller than it was. So you need to change it if you're not getting the same flame that you had originally.
And that can vary with use a little bit, right?
Correct. Yeah. If you're using it every day, it could be a little sooner than 6 months. If it's you're not using it that often, you could wait longer. But since the stuff is corrosive, it's good to rinse out the tank every 6 months. So we still recommend 6 months, even if you're not using it every day.
That'll keep it lasting much longer.
Keep it lasting much longer. Yeah. The booster flux, you're going to be adding booster flux every couple of days, depending on how often you use it. It may be once a day you may need to add booster flux. But once a week, we're recommending taking off the tank completely and rinsing out the booster tank with hot water. That will remove any of the white residue we talked about from the booster flux that goes in there. So those are the main maintenance items. Make sure you change your tip daily or weekly, depending on how often you use it, and that keeps the tip operating at peak efficiency, because the tip can clog up with residues from the booster. And that's really about it. Check your hoses, make sure they don't leak or you didn't burn a hole in them. And that's really it for maintenance.
Well, that's great to hear that these units can actually last a very long time with proper maintenance. I think that's a good point to wrap up today's discussion. So thank you for sharing your knowledge with us, Randy. And I hope you all learned a lot. And for more information on hydrogen torches, you can check out the links below to our online resource center. And as always, if you have any comments or questions, please leave them below or reach out to us. And remember to like and subscribe for more great soldering content. Thanks for watching.